The dinner service had ended at Rossi's, a modest Italian restaurant in downtown Chicago where I'd been working for the past 3 years. I was finishing up my shift, wiping down the last few tables before heading home to my small apartment. The restaurant was nearly empty, just a few lingering customers, nursing their after-dinner coffees. I noticed him the moment he walked in. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. He stood at the entrance, scanning the dining area with purpose. The remaining servers and busboys seemed to freeze, conversations dropping to whispers. "We're closing in 15 minutes. "Sir," my manager called out nervously. The man nodded politely but didn't leave. Instead, he took a seat at the corner table, not taking his eyes off me. There was something familiar about him, but I couldn't place it. My co-workers were stealing glances at him, then at me, as if waiting for something to happen. I continued with my closing duties, untying my sauce-stained apron and folding it carefully. 3 years of serving tables had taught me to move efficiently, to become almost invisible. It was a skill I'd perfected since losing my position at the hospital where I'd worked as a nurse's aide. "Excuse me," the man called, his voice deep and measured. "May I speak with you for a moment?" My manager nodded frantically at me to go over. I approached cautiously, apron still in hand. "I'm sorry, sir, but the kitchen is closed," I said automatically. "I'm not here for food," he replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Please sit down." "My name is Alexander Blackwood." The name hit me like a bolt of lightning. Blackwood. The Blackwood Medical Group owned half the hospitals in the state, including the one where I'd lost my job. My throat went dry. "I'm James," I managed to say. "James Turner." "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Turner," he said, his expression unreadable. "That's precisely why I'm here." The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Even my manager had disappeared into the back, leaving me alone with this powerful stranger. "6 months ago," Alexander Blackwood continued, leaning forward slightly, "you were working at Mercy General as an orderly. You were fired for insubordination. Do you remember why?" My hands tightened around my apron. How could I forget? I'd broken protocol to stay with an elderly patient who was having a panic attack. The charge nurse had ordered me to leave him to attend to a VIP patient on another floor. I'd refused. "I was needed where I was," I said simply. "The patient you stayed with," Blackwood said slowly, "was my father." Everything stopped. The clinking of glasses from the bar, the distant sounds of the kitchen, even my breathing. In that moment, the restaurant seemed to fade away. "Your father?" I repeated numbly. "Yes, Edward Blackwood. He was admitted for routine tests, but he has severe anxiety in medical settings." The staff knew this, but didn't care. They were busy catering to board members touring the facility. His jaw tightened momentarily. "Everyone except you," I remembered the old man clearly now. Thin, frail, clutching at his chest not from physical pain, but from terror. His monitors blaring as his heart rate spiked dangerously high. The charge nurse yelling at me to attend to the priority patients upstairs. My refusal. The security escort from the building the next day. I just did what anyone would do, I mumbled, uncomfortable with his intensity. "No," Blackwood said firmly. "You didn't." When my father told me what happened, I looked into it. "You sat with him for 3 hours. You missed your break. You talked him through breathing exercises. You held his hand until he fell asleep, knowing full well it would cost you your job." I shrugged, not knowing what to say. It hadn't been a calculated decision. It had just been the right thing to do. "After you were fired," he continued, "you didn't contest it. You didn't go to the press. You didn't try to sue the hospital. You just accepted it and moved on. Why? What good would it have done?" I asked honestly. The hospital administrator made it clear the board members were more important than patients. I couldn't work in a place like that anyway. Alexander Blackwood studied me for a long moment. Then unexpectedly he smiled. "My father has been asking about you. For months he's been insisting that I find that kind young man who was the only person in that entire hospital who treated him like a human being rather than an inconvenience." I didn't know what to say. I'd thought about that old man often, wondered if he'd been okay after I left. It took some time to track you down, Blackwood continued. You've kept a remarkably low profile. I'm just trying to make rent, I admitted. This job barely covers it, but it's honest work. Blackwood nodded, as if I'd confirmed something important to him. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed an envelope, placing it carefully on the table between us. 6 months ago, you put my father's needs above your own career. Today, I'd like to return that kindness. He slid the envelope toward me. This isn't charity, Mr. Turner. This is an opportunity. I hesitated before taking it, uncertain what might be inside. Open it, he encouraged. Inside was a letter on Blackwood Medical Group letterhead, offering me a position as Patient Advocacy Director at Mercy General Hospital, the very hospital that had fired me. I don't understand, I stammered. I don't have the qualifications for this. On the contrary, Blackwood said firmly. You're the only person I've found who is qualified. You demonstrated more integrity and compassion in one shift than most healthcare administrators show in their entire careers. But the hospital administrator is no longer with us, he interrupted smoothly. There have been significant changes at Mercy General in recent months. Changes that started the day after you were fired. I stared at the letter, trying to process what was happening. The salary listed was more than 5 times what I was making at the restaurant. It included benefits, a company car, and a signing bonus that would cover a year's rent. Why me? I asked finally. You could hire anyone with actual experience in hospital administration. Experience isn't what we need, Blackwood replied. What we need is someone who remembers why hospitals exist in the first place, to care for patients, not to impress investors. He paused, studying my reaction. My father is the chairman of the Blackwood Foundation. After what happened to him, after what he saw happen to you, he made significant changes to how our hospitals are run. I remember the newspapers mentioning something about the Blackwood Medical Group undergoing restructuring, but I'd been too busy working double shifts to pay much attention. The administrator who fired you was let go, along with the charge nurse who ordered you to abandon my father, he continued. When we investigated further, we found numerous instances of patient neglect, all sacrificed at the altar of hospital politics and donor relations. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. My father is old-fashioned. He believes that character matters more than credentials. When he heard you'd been fired for staying with him, he was furious. He made me promise to find you to make things right. I appreciate the offer, I said carefully, but I don't know the first thing about being a director of anything. You know the most important thing, how to put patients first. The rest you can learn. He smiled slightly. Besides, you'll have support. My father has taken a particular interest in this project. As if on cue, the restaurant door opened again, and an elderly man with a cane made his way slowly toward our table. I recognized him immediately, Edward Blackwood, the patient I'd stayed with that day. He looked healthier now, his color better, his posture straighter despite his reliance on the cane. There he is, the old man said, his voice stronger than I remembered. The only decent person in that whole damn hospital. I stood automatically, offering my hand. Mr. Blackwood, it's good to see you looking well. Instead of taking my hand, Edward Blackwood embraced me, surprising me with the strength of his grip. This young man, he said to his son over my shoulder, is what healthcare should be about. Not spreadsheets, not donors, not prestige, people caring for people. He released me and fixed me with a stern look. I won't take no for an answer, son. We need you. I glanced around the restaurant, at the worn-out tables I'd been wiping down, at my stained apron still clutched in my hand. For 3 years I'd been just getting by, telling myself this was all I deserved after standing up for what I believed in. The hospital staff needs to see that integrity is rewarded, not punished, Alexander Blackwood added. Your return would send a powerful message. I'd be directly involved in patient care. I asked, still hesitant. That's the entire point, Edward answered. You'll be the patient's voice in every executive meeting, every policy discussion. You'll have the authority to implement changes, to hold staff accountable for the care they provide. I thought about all the patients like Edward Blackwood, scared, vulnerable, treated like inconveniences by overworked and desensitized staff. I thought about how different my approach had been, not because I was special, but because I'd simply refused to forget the human element of healthcare. When would I start? I heard myself asking. Both Blackwoods smiled. "As soon as you're ready," Alexander replied. "The position has been open for months. My father wouldn't let us fill it until we found you." Edward Blackwood placed his hand on my shoulder. "You didn't just help me that day, son. You reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that one person standing firm for what's right can change an entire system." My manager emerged from the kitchen, staring wide-eyed at the three of us. "Mr. Turner," Alexander Blackwood said formally, "will you accept the position?" I looked down at my apron one last time, then set it on the table. "Yes," I said firmly. "I will," Edward Blackwood beamed. "I knew you would." He turned to my manager. "This young man will be giving his notice. I hope 2 weeks will be sufficient." My manager nodded frantically, clearly intimidated by the presence of the Blackwoods. Of course, sir." As we walked toward the exit, the few remaining customers and staff watched in amazement. I could hardly believe it myself. 3 years of struggling, of questioning my decision to stand up for what was right, and now this. At the door, Alexander handed me his card. "We'll be in touch tomorrow to sort out the details. My assistant will help you find appropriate housing closer to the hospital. I can find my own apartment," I began. Edward Blackwood interrupted with a chuckle. "Son, you're about to be in charge of making sure wealthy board members don't get preferential treatment over regular patients. You think we're going to let you live in some rundown place? You'll need to look the part if they're going to take you seriously." As they turned to leave, Edward paused and looked back at me. "You know, when everyone else left me alone in that hospital room, I thought to myself, this is how the world works now. Nobody cares anymore. Then you sat down beside me and proved me wrong." His eyes were bright with emotion. "Sometimes all it takes is one person doing the right thing to restore your faith in humanity." The next day, as I gave my notice at the restaurant, my co-workers couldn't believe the story. Neither could I, really. But 2 weeks later, I walked through the front doors of Mercy General Hospital, not as an orderly, but as the new patient advocacy director. The same security guard who had escorted me out 6 months earlier now nodded respectfully as I passed. In the elevator, nurses and doctors looked at me curiously, some recognizing me, others simply noting my new position. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, I stepped out with purpose. A secretary showed me to my new office, a space larger than my entire apartment. On the desk was a framed note that read simply, "Always remember why you're here." EB, I set down my briefcase, straightened my tie, and prepared to make good on my promise. This wasn't about status or salary. It was about ensuring that every patient who walked through those doors would be treated with the dignity and care they deserved. Because sometimes doing the right thing does pay off, not always in ways you can anticipate, and rarely when you expect it. But when it does, it reminds you why integrity matters in the first place. My first week as patient advocacy director was a baptism by fire. The executive staff regarded me with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The former orderly who'd somehow leapfrogged over their carefully constructed hierarchy. In meetings, I could feel their skepticism like a physical weight. Mr. Turner, Dr. Helena Mercer, the chief of surgery, addressed me during my first executive committee meeting. "While your unique perspective is appreciated, you must understand that hospitals operate on efficiency and resource management. We simply cannot accommodate every patient's personal comfort preferences." She was responding to my proposal to extend visiting hours for elderly patients, particularly those showing signs of confusion or distress when alone. With respect, "Dr. Mercer," I replied, keeping my voice steady, "I'm not suggesting we accommodate preferences. I'm suggesting we address medical necessities. Studies consistently show that elderly patients recover faster and Experience fewer complications when family support is present. Studies can be interpreted many ways, she countered dismissively. I took a deep breath. Perhaps we should ask Mr. Edward Blackwood to share his experience. I understand his heart rate increased to dangerous levels when left alone, despite being here for routine tests. The room fell silent. Everyone knew exactly who Edward Blackwood was and what his opinion on patient care had become. That's an isolated incident, Dr. Mercer said, but her confidence had visibly wavered. Is it? I asked, sliding a folder across the table. I've compiled incident reports from the past year. There are 17 cases where elderly patients experience similar distress when isolated from family support. 3 resulted in falls when patients attempted to leave their rooms unassisted. 1 resulted in a lawsuit. The CFO, Martin Webb, glanced through the report with narrowed eyes. Implementing extended visiting hours would require additional security and nursing staff coverage. That's an expense we haven't budgeted for. I've done the math, I replied, sliding another document forward. The cost of 3 additional security, rotations and nursing support is substantially less than the settlement from last year's lawsuit. Not to mention the 6 additional days of hospitalization for the fall. Victims. Edward Blackwood had coached me well for this meeting. Lead with compassion, he'd advised, but back it up with numbers. That's the language they understand. The hospital administrator, Janet Collins, who had replaced the man who fired me, studied me thoughtfully. You've done your homework, Mr. Turner. I believe in being prepared, I replied simply. Very well, she nodded. We'll implement a pilot program on the geriatric and cardiac floors. 3 months, with data collection on patient outcomes and resource utilization. If the results support your hypothesis, we'll expand hospital-wide. It was a small victory, but a significant one. As the meeting adjourned, I noticed Dr. Mercer lingering, waiting until the others had left. That was well played, she said, her tone neutral. But I should warn you, not everyone appreciates having their methods questioned by someone with no medical background. I'm not questioning medical decisions, I clarified. I'm advocating for the human elements that make those decisions effective. Doctors treat diseases, but they're housed in people with emotional and psychological needs. She studied me for a moment longer. You genuinely believe this, don't you? It's not just political maneuvering for you. I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe it, I answered honestly. She nodded slowly. My mother was hospitalized last year. Different hospital, similar policies. She was confused, frightened. I wasn't allowed to stay overnight despite being a physician myself. Something vulnerable flickered across her face. Perhaps there's merit to what you're suggesting. But tread carefully, Mr. Turner. Change happens slowly in institutions like this. The warning was clear, but so was the unexpected support. As I gathered my materials, I felt cautiously optimistic. Over the next few weeks, I immersed myself in the hospital's operations. I shadowed nurses during their shifts, sat with patients during meals, and observed admission procedures. What I found was both encouraging and troubling. Most staff genuinely wanted to provide excellent care, but systems designed for efficiency often worked against compassion. One morning, I received an urgent call from the emergency department. An elderly woman had been brought in with pneumonia but was refusing treatment. She keeps asking for her son, the nurse explained. But he's not answering his phone. She won't let anyone touch her until he's here. I hurried down to find Mrs. Eleanor Washington, 84, huddled in a treatment bay, her breathing labored but her determination fierce. Mrs. Washington, I introduced myself gently. I'm James Turner, the patient advocacy director. May I sit with you while we try to reach your son? She eyed me suspiciously. They want to admit me. I can't afford to stay here. I pulled up a chair. I understand your concern. Let's talk through your options. But first, would it be all right if the doctors gave you something to help with your breathing while we sort this out? You seem uncomfortable. She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. As the nurse administered oxygen, I spoke with Mrs. Washington about her son, her home, her concerns. Gradually, her anxiety eased. When the financial counselor arrived, I stayed, helping Mrs. Washington navigate the complex paperwork for Medicare and supplemental assistance. By the time her son arrived 2 hours later, she had agreed to admission and treatment. "Thank you," her son whispered to me as his mother was wheeled to a room. "Mum's been terrified of hospital since Dad died alone in one last year. Nobody's ever taken the time to just talk to her." That afternoon, I drafted a new protocol for elderly patients arriving without family support. A dedicated liaison would be assigned immediately to address non-medical concerns alongside treatment. When I presented it at the next staff meeting, Dr. Mercer was the first to voice support. Mr. Turner's intervention with Mrs. Washington potentially prevented a much more serious case, she noted. The patient received treatment 8 hours earlier than she might have otherwise. From a medical standpoint alone, that's significant. The protocol was approved unanimously. 3 months into my role, Edward Blackwood invited me to lunch. We met at a small cafe near the hospital, away from the politics and pressures of Mercy General. "You're making waves," he observed, stirring his tea. "In a good way. Patient satisfaction scores are up 17% on the pilot floors." "There's still resistance," I admitted. "Change is hard, especially when it challenges established power structures." "Speaking of which," Edward set down his spoon, his expression turning serious. "The board is meeting next week to review the expansion of your pilot programs. Not everyone is pleased with the direction you're taking." My stomach tightened. "Your son mentioned there might be opposition." "Opposition is putting it mildly," Edward replied grimly. "Gregory Harrington leads the faction against you. He's an old-school board member who believes hospitals should be run like businesses, patients be damned. He's gathering support to block your initiatives and, if possible, eliminate your position entirely." "On what grounds?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "That you lack credentials, that your programs are costly indulgences, that patient comfort is secondary to financial efficiency." Edward's eyes flashed with anger. The usual garbage from people who haven't set foot in a patient room in decades. The board meeting was scheduled for Wednesday morning. I spent the weekend preparing my presentation, gathering data, testimonials, and financial projections. On Monday, I walked the hospital floors, speaking with nurses and patients, reassuring myself that the changes we'd implemented were making a real difference. In the cardiology waiting room, a middle-aged man approached me. "Mr. Turner, I'm David Ramirez. My father was admitted last month, congestive heart failure. I wanted to thank you for that family support program. Being able to stay overnight with him, it meant everything. His gratitude strengthened my resolve. This wasn't about me or my position. It was about patients like Mr. Ramirez and their families." Wednesday arrived with a sense of foreboding. I dressed carefully in the suit Alexander had insisted on buying me. As I approached the boardroom, I heard raised voices from within, making a mockery of proper procedure, someone was saying heatedly. "Appointing an unqualified orderly to an executive position. My father's decision was approved by this board," Alexander replied coolly. "Under emotional duress," the first voice countered. Edward's experience clouded his judgment. "This hospital cannot be run on feelings. We have shareholders to answer to." I recognized the speaker when I entered, Gregory Harrington, pharmaceutical executive and major hospital donor. He fell silent as I took my seat, but his contemptuous glance made his feelings clear. The board chair, Margaret Wilson, called the meeting to order. "Today, we're reviewing the outcomes of initiatives implemented by our patient advocacy director, Mr. Turner." I stood, distributing folders to each member. "Over the past 3 months, we've piloted several programs designed to improve patient outcomes through enhanced emotional support. I walked them through the data: decreased length of stay, reduced readmission rates, improved satisfaction scores, and better clinical outcomes. While there were implementation costs, I concluded the financial projections show net savings of approximately $1.2 million annually if expanded hospital-wide, primarily through reduced complications and readmissions. Gregory Harrington spoke first. Impressive presentation. However, I question attributing these outcomes solely to your comfort measures. Correlation is not causation, which is why we implemented controlled trials, I replied evenly. Floors 3 and 5 used the new protocols, while floors 4 and 6 maintained standard procedures. The differences were statistically significant. Harrington's smile didn't reach his eyes, and yet you have no background in research methodology. Who helped you design this study? Before I could answer, Dr. Mercer spoke up. I did, Mr. Harrington. My team oversaw the methodology. The results are sound. Harrington seemed taken aback by her support. And the additional staffing costs? Who absorbs those expenses? As Mr. Turner demonstrated, Margaret Wilson interjected, the net effect is cost positive. Fewer complications mean shorter stays and fewer resources utilized. Finally, Harrington laid his cards on the table. Let's be honest. Mr. Blackwood had an unfortunate experience and created a position for the person who helped him. It's a lovely story, but it's not how hospitals should operate. Mr. Turner lacks the qualifications for an executive role. I moved to restructure the patient advocacy initiative under existing departmental leadership. In other words, eliminate my position. The room fell silent. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. May I respond? I asked quietly. I stood again, looking around the table. Mr. Harrington is correct about one thing. I don't have traditional qualifications. What I have is perspective. I've been the orderly cleaning bedpans. I've been the patient terrified of a diagnosis. I've been the family member sleeping in an uncomfortable chair because I didn't trust the system. I paused. Hospitals don't exist for administrators or shareholders. They exist for patients. Somewhere along the way, many of us have forgotten that. My job is to remind us, Edward Blackwood finally spoke. Before we vote, there's something the board should know. He nodded to Alexander, who distributed new documents. What's this? Harrington demanded. Financial disclosures, Edward replied calmly. Specifically your undisclosed interests in pharmaceutical companies that supply Mercy General. Harrington's face reddened. This is outrageous. Your investments in Westbrook Pharmaceuticals are public, Alexander agreed. However, your controlling interest in Aperture Medical Supply through shell companies was absent from your conflict of interest statements. Margaret Wilson frowned deeply. Mr. Harrington, these allegations are serious. If accurate, they represent a significant breach of ethics. This is a transparent attempt to distract from the issue, Harrington sputtered. On the contrary, Edward said mildly, Mr. Turner's initiatives have reduced the use of certain medical supplies by implementing evidence-based protocols. Supplies provided by Aperture. Your opposition isn't about qualifications, it's about protecting your profits. The mood shifted palpably. Board members who had seemed aligned with Harrington now distanced themselves. Margaret Wilson cleared her throat. In light of this information, I suggest we table Mr. Harrington's motion pending an ethics review. Instead, let's vote on the expansion of the patient-centered initiatives as originally planned. The vote was overwhelmingly in favor. As the meeting adjourned, Harrington stormed out without speaking to anyone. Edward approached me. Well done, son. You held your ground admirably. You knew about Harrington's conflicts all along, I realized. I suspected, he corrected. Alexander confirmed it. We waited to use that information until truly necessary. Playing politics after all? I asked, somewhat disappointed. Edward shook his head. Not politics, strategy. Sometimes doing the right thing requires knowing when to fight. You can't help patients if you're removed from your position. As we walked out together, Edward added, Harrington won't be back. His resignation will be on Margaret's desk by tomorrow. But there will be others like him. This was just the first battle in a longer war, as long as patients benefit. It's worth fighting, I replied. Outside the hospital, beneath the spring sunshine, I felt a sense of purpose I'd never experienced before. 6 months ago, I'd been fired for doing the right thing. Today, I'd been vindicated for the same reason, because in the end, hospitals aren't about buildings or systems. They're about people caring for people at their most vulnerable moments. And sometimes, all it takes is one person standing firm on that principle to change everything.